This week, we're discussing chassis. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the SCX24 budget build-off. In this series, Matt from the Scale Builders Guild and myself take an Axial SCX24 of our choosing and we upgrade it with $50 every week. Last week was freebie week, so we didn't technically spend money last week, but this week we're back to it. And this week we're going to dive into chassis. Specifically, I'm going to talk to you about making your own chassis. You would think a DIY item like that might have fallen into last week, but this one's still going to cost you a little bit. But I think the rewarding part of building your own chassis is worth spending a little bit of money on. And once you do it once, you'll understand that it's not all that difficult of a process. And I'm going to give you a number of tools to make this way easier than just diving in blind. I'm going to talk you through the process of ways that you can do it with some very basic hand tools. And then we're also going to talk about taking and incorporating 3D printing into it as well. Number of things to discuss, but first, let's discuss what we got done last week during Free Week. On our Betty that we have here, we looked at modifying the center of gravity a little bit further than what we had before. The first thing that we did was we modified the rear battery tray. We took the stock one, we kind of cut it and flipped it to allow us to drop the battery much further down, lowering our center of gravity even further, which has been something I've harped on week after week during this build. I also presented a 3D printable option that I uploaded onto Thingiverse so that you could just 3D print and bolt in yourself. After that, we went into a more in-depth process of taking the stock combination ESC receiver, removing the plastic shroud, removing some components off of the PCB inside, and just getting it smaller and lighter and lower. So why even look at changing out the chassis? What are the benefits? Is there any point in doing it? Is it just style? Why? Why? Just like all modifications, there's a number of ways that a new chassis could benefit you in performance and benefit you in style. But just like with many upgrades, if you don't do things right or you choose the wrong options, then it can hurt your performance and in some cases, I think, hurt the styling, even though that's a little bit more personal preference. But what I want to get into today is my mindset of what I go through when I'm actually designing my own chassis. And then after we go through a brief overview of the CAD, I'm going to upload and be able to give you guys a paper drawing of a template for the chassis that I've designed. And that is what we're going to get into the discussion of being able to construct yourself. But also don't worry, if you're the 3D printer type and you just want to click a button and walk away, I'm also going to give you a fully 3D printable version as well. So now let's talk about the actual chassis design. I've got my finished chassis here in front of me, but let's discuss a little bit about how we got there. I do all of my chassis design in CAD, obviously, and for that I use Fusion 360 here at home. So I jump into the software and I start pulling hard points that I know are not going to change, like the skid plate bolt pattern spacing on the side and the bumper mounting spacing in the front and rear. From there, I decide what changes that I want to make, like modifying suspension points to allow for more suspension up travel while keeping the truck nice and low. That was something that I was definitely after. So I took and I moved my shock mounts a little bit more in towards the center and a little bit lower, just to try and give my shocks a little bit more angle, allow them to move, but still control the axle properly. That was a big thing that I wanted to get accomplished with this chassis. Then there was other features that I wanted to incorporate, such as shock position adjustability. I decided to go with an array of 9 holes, both front and rear, so that I had room to move my shocks around at the top, just to make sure that the truck was going to perform how I really wanted in the end. I also incorporated things like some rock slider areas and some electronics mounting areas on the side, a tray in the rear. No matter if I was wanting to mount battery on the side or ESC, whatever it was, I wanted to be able to have a place to do that. On these tabs that I added on the chassis, I also added a kind of a slot on the bottom, and that is for the Velcro strap that comes factory in the truck to go through. That way, if I decide to put a battery on the side, I can still use the Velcro strap. Since I was going with 3D printed cross braces, I did have to change up my body mounting style. I went with a 3mm screw up in the front. The Betty uses a single body post, and since I'm using 3D printing, that would be a little bit too fragile. So I got rid of the body post and pin idea, went to that screw. Not necessarily as convenient, but I think it'll probably look better. And I don't mind carrying a 2mm driver with me. In the rear, I got rid of the hinge design, and instead I went with a pinned setup. I designed a new bumper and a new inner piece that has two 3mm set screws that stick out of it. Those two 3mm set screws, those tie into that rear bumper cross brace, and they allow the body to adjust front to back until it lines up perfectly with that 3mm screw in the front. It allows the body to come completely off the chassis easily compared to that hinged method, and I think that it's basically just as convenient as having the hinge alone. I have here in front of me 4 different examples of this chassis and different ways that you can make it. Now, the easy option is here. These are simply 3D printed. I'm going to give you guys all of the files for this in case you just want to take them and 3D print it. You can 3D print the entire chassis. It's what I did at the very beginning, and it'll work fine. And if that's the route you want to go, fantastic. That's one option. The second option is to cut it out of some plastic. This is 2mm ABS. I picked up a sheet of this 2mm thick ABS at my local hobby shop, and it was $5.59. This was all the portion that I needed to actually make 2 chassis rails from it. And the way to do this is that you'll take and print out this paper, and then the way that I found best is to cut it a little bit tighter to the shape, not right at the shape of it, a little bit tighter, and then tape it with some masking tape to your material. Before I make any of the outside cuts, I'll go through and center punch each one of the individual holes on this plan so that I can then go through and drill those before cutting the outside. That is an important note. To drill the holes, you'll want to use a drill bit that's somewhere around 1.5mm or 0.060 inches. I'll find one available online and link to it. Otherwise, maybe you have one already around the house that you could use. From there, you're just going to start carving away at it, whatever method works best for you, whether you have a bandsaw or a Dremel, a hand saw or a jeweler's saw, coping saws, anything like that. Just take your time and go through cutting just nice and close to the actual template. In the end, you can end up with something that looks probably better than this. My plastic one, I was going a little fast and was getting a little bit too hot with the rotary tool and started kind of having some melting problems with the ABS. Probably could use a little bit more cleanup with the files to make it look nice and pretty, but in the end, this would be a functional chassis. Next, we have an aluminum option. Now, this one I cut out of a little bit thicker aluminum. The only aluminum that I had handy at the time was 2.4mm thick. That made this one just a little bit beefier than I think is needed for the SCX24. I mean, I can bend it, but you would never need this thick. And also it just makes it a little bit more difficult to work with. This was the aluminum sheet that I had. This was a much larger sheet, and this was only like $3 and something. I don't specifically know because I cut off exactly how much. But like I said, I just masking tape it onto my actual aluminum, spot and drill my holes, then start cutting and trimming away, sanding the shape until you get what you're after. Now, if you want to go the aluminum chassis route, you can always just go to your hobby shop. Again, this is 0.064 aluminum, which is about the thickness that you would want. And this was $3.99. This was cheaper than the ABS plastic. This was $5.59. So this piece, definitely big enough to do both chassis rails for under $4. And then of course, there's also an option like carbon fiber. Now, carbon fiber, I want to just stress over and over how careful you should be with working with carbon fiber. Anytime that I'm working with carbon fiber, I wear proper PPE, as you should with anything, but specifically carbon fiber. Some sort of respirator is a must to work with carbon fiber. Safety glasses, gloves, whatever you need to. You do not want to breathe those fibers or get them in your eyes. If you decide to go carbon fiber route, I can't stress enough how safe I want you to be. Plastic and aluminum both are easier to work with than carbon fiber. Now you've got your chassis rails, you've cut them however you decided to do that. The cross braces though, if you don't have a 3D printer, you need to be able to purchase these. So I took all of the components that I went through in the CAD process and I put them and attached them into a single piece so that you could purchase them with one part on Shapeways. It's gonna come as kind of a ball of parts and you're gonna have to snip them off so that they come apart. But that allows it to be much more affordable than if you were to buy each one individually. Instead, you're able to pick these up for just over 25 bucks for all of the rest of those 3D printed components that I talked about. Now, it is the exact components that I've talked about, especially the front body mount and the rear body mount. So depending on what body you're looking for, may not be 100% ideal. But if the reception to the chassis is positive and someone wants a little bit more universal body mounting approach, then I'll work on something for you guys. Let me know in the comments below what you guys think of that idea. But if you've got a 3D printer at home instead, the good news is that every file that we've talked about so far, all of those are going up on my Thingiverse so that you guys can download every component of this chassis and 3D print it yourself at home. But now I'm going to get into installing my new chassis design onto my budget build. I am really excited for this. I've had this chassis done for a number of weeks and I've been holding off installing it until we were able to fit it into the series. And today is the day. So let's dive in and get this accomplished. And the new chassis is installed. I'm excited. Finally get to use the chassis that I've worked on for quite a while. Everything sits on there nice. The suspension moves super freely. I'm really happy with the overall stance of how this sits. Now, one thing to note is that since the motor is currently in the stock location, I did have to trim that rear kind of tray that I had there. I had to trim it about halfway back. I could have notched it, but I just trimmed it all the way across. Since I'm printing these myself at home, I can always just reprint another one. But for now, with the motor where it's at, it did need to be trimmed. You could have possibly flipped the motor around and done some modifications to the lengths of the drive shafts to make that all work. But for me, what I was trying to do for now wasn't what I was after. As we're sitting here, I couldn't be happier with the position of how this truck is sitting. Now, like I said, this has got that rear body system, which uses 2 set screws to slide into that rear cross brace. And then with it slid into position, I'll tighten down that 3mm screw in the front, and we've got our final ride height. Nice and low. The tires are nearly at the top of the bed, but I'm able to articulate. I get a little bit of rubbing here at the very top, but I don't think that I'm too concerned about that. The truck is just much more smooth compared to where we came from with the stock Betty. The top of these trucks is almost at the same place. The budget build may even be a little bit lower compared to the stock one. And with our larger tires and more suspension flex, that's pretty notable. Now, getting the most flex out of your vehicle is not everything, and you really don't want just a huge amount of flex because it can make a vehicle less predictable, a little bit more unstable. You usually want to aim for slightly more than a tire height, which is about where we're sitting with this truck right now, compared to stock, which had much less before it pulls that front tire. The stance of these two trucks is so wildly different. I couldn't be happier. But there was a lot of information in this episode, and we need to get to the tally portion. Now, for the chassis material, the chassis that I made was made out of carbon fiber, and that's the most expensive material. I talked about two much less expensive materials, but since I didn't use that, that's not the one that I'm going to count. The carbon fiber that I used is 2mm, and I found a place that you could buy a small sheet that would be enough for doing both chassis rails like I used here, and it cost $13.66. So compared to the $4 or $6 that those other two materials cost, much more expensive, but since that's what I used, I'm putting it in the budget. The other thing is that even though I printed all of the components for this truck myself, I'm going to include the cost of having them done at Shapeways. So the cost of that is $26.40. Since I got them into a single unit bundle, the cost is fairly reasonable. So that puts the cost for the week at $40.06. So with our $50 budget for this week and a balance of $16.08 from week 3, that's going to leave us with $26.02 to carry over into week 6, which is coming up soon, where we're going to dive back into some off-the-shelf parts where you can throw them onto your truck just like we'll be doing here. As always, I appreciate you guys watching. Make sure you go check out Matt's video for week 5 and see what he's doing with that crazy cab over rear motor thing that he's building. Much appreciated. Hit the like button if you enjoy these videos. Subscribe if you're not already, and hit the notification bell so you see the videos as soon as they get uploaded. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.